great employees in one business 10 years ago may not be great now. And I work in recruitment, have done for 20 years. When I started, there was no AI or a use of email even in the way that we use it today. It was about door knocking and going around to people's offices and walking in and saying, I can help you, and looking through Rolodex cards.
While the world has changed in terms of what it demands of DEI, DEI is still being defined within this very small definition where it's basically an HR program.
Welcome to the HR L&D Podcast, where we explore cutting-edge HR trends and best practices with top leaders who are shaping the future of work. Hello and welcome back to the HR L&D Podcast. My name is Nick Day. I'm CEO at JGA Recruitment Group, and we are specialist HR recruiters. And today I'm joined by Joseph Santana, who is chairman of the CDO PowerCircle, an association of top DEI leaders from companies that generate nearly $750 billion in revenue with 1 million employees. He's also the creator and host of the award-winning ERG PowerTalk podcast, which essentially means we've got a podcast pro on the show with me today, and that makes me really, really excited. That show on its own has distributed over $100,000 worth of free training annually, reaching over 300 million listeners. And he's also the author and thought leader of a number of books, a couple of which we're going to be talking about today. One of those is called Supercharge Your ERGs, 18 Tips to Power Up Your ERG Strategy. But more recently, he's released another book called The New DEI and ERG Frontier. And I highlight those because Joe has quite a unique perspective on both of those subjects. And it's something I'm really keen to bring to the show for all of you to listen to as well. I should also add that Joe is a member of the Forbes Business Council and the Fast Company Executive Board. He helps Fortune 500 and global firms to grow and thrive in the increasingly diverse and global 21st century workforce and marketplace. And we will be examining that during the course of the show as well. Ultimately, his practical insights into the current and future business impacting uses for DEI are fascinating. And I think it's going to take you all to a new level of thinking. So stay tuned, because if you're an HR leader who wants to seize on DEI opportunities, then I think you're going to enjoy this conversation very much. We will, of course, talk about the latest book, The New DEI and ERG Frontier as well, where Joe's going to try and show exactly how DEI and ERG efforts can rise and thrive in this new world of constant disruption. So that's enough for me. Without further ado, it leads me to say, welcome, Joe Santana, to the HR L&D Podcast. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling great. It's a pleasure being here, and your energy is infectious. So I feel more pumped up than I did before when I first arrived.
Fantastic. Well, that's what we like to hear, right? Let's get the listeners pumped up as well. I'm going to start with the first question, which I ask all of my guests, which is this: what do the words human resources mean to you?
Yeah, to me, the word human resources covers a practice which I think is vital to the life of any organization, because clearly people are the lifeblood of companies, and human resources is the organization that essentially collects that talent, brings it together, marshals it, and makes sure that it's properly engaged and performing at the highest level. So I think that it sits right up there, with financial planning and all the other components that make an organization successful.
Fantastic. All a great start. Well, we talk about then, you mentioned at the end of that answer, what makes an organization successful. Now, I've done a lot of these shows with DEI experts, and we've covered some fantastic content. One thing I wanted to ask you, because you've got that business mindset, you've got that advisory expertise of working with business leaders to improve organizational success at a performance level. With that in mind, why is DEI so increasingly vital to the economic success of a business? We talk a lot about the benefits for the employee, which I understand. What about the success of an organization?
Well, Nick, if you look at any type of statistic chart that shows demographics in a country, take the United States, for example, sure. The one thing that becomes apparent is that we're becoming increasingly more diverse. In fact, in the United States, it's predicted by 2045, people that are considered to be the minority will be in the majority. And that's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be 2044, things are the way they were 10 years ago, and then suddenly the switch is going to happen in 2045. It's happening gradually every single day. So every single day, every single year, every single election cycle, the electorate, the market, your investors, your workforce is changing into this new group, this minority majority that's emerging. And in order for organizations to be able to be successful, they have to be able to draw and engage a workforce from that group. And they have to be able to sell and market their products and services to this new group that has different tastes and a variety of different things that they value. So preparing for that now is preparing to succeed, as opposed to being surprised in the future as if this were some black swan, when in reality, we can anticipate it. In fact, I often tell people that it's already a fait accompli, because if you look at just the people that are 11 years old and 10 years old, you can already see the demographic mix. They're already here. They're just not in the workforce yet, or a few of the older ones are in the workforce. So that transformation is not something that we're predicting just based on some mathematical model. These people are here. And similarly, that's happening around the world. And also, another thing that's happening is the world is becoming more and more globalized in terms of its workforce, which adds another dimension of diversity, because now you've got other elements that were not maybe part of, let's say, for example, in the United States, they may not have been something that the United States was focusing on. But now all of a sudden, things like caste systems or other terms and systems that exist in other places in the world begin to become part of our workforce as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we're communicating now right across the pond, and we're in different locations. And if this is a workforce, there's no reason this couldn't be a management meeting, a one-to-one meeting, or beyond. And we can recruit now across borders. We're seeing that as a recruitment firm that I obviously CEO here. What I thought was really interesting, though, you talk about the success of an organization. And I think it's something people often don't consider. If we want to improve our ability to be inclusive, improve our ability to be diverse, actually, it's important that performance is considered in that equation, because the more successful a business, the more opportunity it has to scale, the more employees it can hire, and the bigger impact effectively it can have in all of those facets. And I haven't really heard that connection used much before, sort of linking it to performance, but it makes sense. But you also said that a lot has changed. A lot is continuing to change. You mentioned the globalization of businesses. Bearing in mind all that change, then, what do DEI leaders now, what kind of skills do they need just to be able to manage DEI effectively in the 21st century with all of this rapid technological shifts, AI and all the other things that started to infiltrate the market?
Yeah, in order for DEI leaders to be effective today, they clearly need more skills. They need to find ways within the organization to automate or somehow outsource, for lack of a better word, certain tasks that perhaps they were doing in the past, which are still valuable and need to be done, but they need to open up time to do other things that are becoming increasingly important. So you mentioned AI as an example. DEI leaders need to be involved in that process as well. They don't need to be technical experts, but they need to be involved to the degree that they sit on committees or they're involved in helping to put together the practice policies of how you measure the success and effectiveness of a DEI system. Otherwise, what can happen is the system can begin to recreate the world and the conditions of the time and the people who created it. I mean, we all know stories about Amazon's system that wouldn't hire women because it looked for certain traits, and because Amazon traditionally had more men, it assumed that that was a feature that it should look for. So we've all heard these stories. We want to make sure that these things don't creep into our company, because what we don't want to have is an organization where we're preserving a management makeup and a culture that was maybe suitable for the 1950s, but is not suitable for the 21st century market or workforce. And to do that, we have to have DEI people that are involved in that. That's a different skill set than running DEI training or helping the organization to hire more people of color or helping the organization to hire more women. So DEI leaders also need to continue to upgrade their own skills and to become more effective in dealing with things like AI, for example. And another thing that's always been out there but hasn't been paid attention to much, Nick, is equity. We all talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And right after we say those words, we focus a lot on the diversity part.
Or inclusion and belonging.
Or the inclusion, which is, now that we've got people in here, let's make them feel comfortable. What we don't focus on a lot is the equity. And to your point that you made earlier, we want the organization to be productive and effective, to have an economic impact. And the only way that you can do that is if the organization is set up to support the success of all of its employees. So if you have a workforce, let's say, for example, you have a sales force, and in that sales force, there are some people that are living, a la 1950s, wife at home, taking care of the kids, and they're just focused on the job. And you've got another 50% of the people who do not have that particular setup. Maybe they're working moms or even dads who are working, but who now take a more active role, let's say, in child rearing. And you have, let's say, outdated reimbursement policies that will reimburse us if I take you out for a martini as a client, but won't reimburse me if I incur childcare in order to go meet with you as a client. Literally, what we're doing is we're supporting the activity of a shrinking group. People who have that wife at home, who are totally dedicated to the particular job. And we can go across a lot of dimensions in that. As organizations morph themselves from organizations that were designed to support the workforce of the 20th century or mid-20th century into organizations that fully support the workforce that's emerging in the 21st century, they're going to get more productivity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm going to, because I know what question I'm going to ask you next is based on a wonderful quote that I heard you say. I'm going to use an animal reference, as you might know which quote I'm going to use, but I'll get to that. The way you described it there, it's a bit like a snake shedding its skin. A lot of organizations need to shed their old skins and create their new one in order for it to really work in the new world of work. There's a coaching saying that says, "What got you here won't get you there." And I think that a lot of people need to get with the profile now and realize we need change to happen because, as you said, the demographic's changing anyway. And in 20 years from now, it's going to be different. And those that take the longest to get on board are going to be the ones that suffer. And we need to, make change now. Let's not sit around. The animal reference I was going to mention is I was going to ask you a question about why do most DEI efforts fail? And the reason I was going to ask that in relation to business results is I heard you once say it is because they are shoving elephants into houses built for giraffes. So tell me a little bit more about that. In particular, I was quite interested to know how ERGs and BRGs can also play a role in promoting diversity and inclusion in the workplace. You may want to talk about that slightly separately, but why are most of them failing?
Yeah, that little saying that I have, I actually picked it out from a book that was written many years ago by a Dr. R. Roosevelt Thomas. And in the book, he provides this fable about a giraffe that built this beautiful house. And, the house was designed specifically for the giraffe. It had the narrow halls, but the ceilings were very high. The floorboards and everything were set up properly to support the weight of a giraffe. And he had a workshop where he would work, and he saw his friend, an elephant, who he knew was an excellent woodworker. So he decided to invite him in. And when the elephant tried to come in, the first problem was, of course, the door was too narrow. And then, of course, they removed a couple of panels, and he was able to enter through the garage where the workshop was. And once he was inside, the elephant found other problems. Like, for example, he couldn't navigate through the hallways into any part of the home because, again, the walls were too narrow. The floors were too weak to support his weight. They would creak when he put his foot down. And so at the end of the story, the giraffe's solution was, well, maybe you need to go to the local gym and go on a diet so that you could fit better in this house, as opposed to as opposed to remodeling the house so that it could
Sure.
accommodate the elephant as well. And so the reason why I say that a lot of organizations fail because they are trying to stuff elephants into a house built for a giraffe is because most workplaces, again, we can reference the United States, most United States workplaces are built using practices and policies that were designed to support and here's the long string answer, a white Christian male with a stay-at-home wife. That's what they were designed to support. Everything from the reimbursement systems to all the different support systems, they were designed to support this person who could just dedicate themselves to work. If you ever watched the popular TV show from back in the 1950s or 60s, Leave It to Beaver, it was dad who went to work, mom at home with the two kids, etc. That world does not exist anymore, especially when you're talking about people that come from different lived experiences, not only women, but also people that come from just different backgrounds from around the world, different religions, different values, and so forth. That's why in the United States, most companies still pay for, let's say, Christian holidays, but other holidays, you have to take a personal day, right? So the whole system is set up for the giraffe, and that's the giraffe that I just described before. In the meantime, we're trying to make elephants feel included. We're doing outreach to bring them in. So they come in, they join the company. And then we do everything. We'll hold a party and we'll have groups that get together to make them feel good. We love you. You're welcome. But in the meantime, the elephant is walking around a house where he can barely make it through the walls. The weight of his body is too much for the floor. And literally, it's in some cases, people have to try to fit themselves as, a round peg in a square hole. And no matter how much you try and no matter how many noble efforts HR has, and they do as best they can, it's hard to actually be able to make a person feel included in a system that is not designed to actually support them or understand how they operate or their values. And so it's way past time. That book was written back in the 1900s. We are way past time when we need to start looking at these institutions and asking ourselves, how do we need to remodel this institution so that it's more effective in supporting this workforce that we have now and this workforce that's emerging, as opposed to just trying to bring them in and then make them feel good about being there? How do we make the organization actually support them more effectively? And where that ties into your BRGs and your ERGs and organizations is that one of the most valuable things that you can get out of this group is their perspectives. You can find out from them, hey, what's working for you? What helps you to succeed here? If you could just, wave a magic wand and change one thing that you think would make you and other people like you more successful here, how would that be? That is great input that an organization can then use to turn around and look at their institutional practices and policies and say, okay, how do we modify this so that it's inclusive in a real sense, not just in an emotional outreach sense, but in a real sense of everyone that we've got in the organization? Do that, and you become more effective as an organization. And I always like to compare this with my ESG friends to climate change. All the things that we need to do to prepare for Earth getting warmer, we knew about these years ago. And now everything that we need to do in order to make organizations more effective in terms of dealing with this new workforce and effectively leveraging it in the marketplace, Dr. Thomas was writing about it decades ago. It's just that that's been ignored. And what we've been doing is we've been trying to make people happy in an environment that is not actually designed. And by the way, Nick, one last thing on this, and that is That's what's creating the divide also between senior management's assessment of how they're doing and employee assessment. So there's a big divide between how employees answer the question, how's your company doing relative to DEI, and the way senior leaders. Because senior leaders are thinking, well, we're doing a lot of outreach to bring people in, and we're doing all these different things to make them feel included, and we celebrate heritage months and so forth. But people, on the other hand, are looking at it from the standpoint of the real opportunities they have in the organization, how supported they feel in actually being successful and rising through the organization. Attack equity and you resolve that gap.
Yeah, what a great response. You've really brought that to life for those that are visual learners anyway, like I am. It was a fantastic response, and makes total sense. I think there's a few things that I take away from that response. One is, and I link it back to what got you here and get you there. A lot of the people at the minute that are trying to make change are doing it with the thinking that got them to where they are now. But as you say, thinking's moved on. And actually there's a quicker way to the ultimate goal, which is you need to say, what is that I want to achieve, not just next year? What do I want to achieve in 10 years? If I could achieve what I want to achieve in 10 years within 1 year, what would I have to change? 10xing the actual impact we want to have will encourage people to think more innovatively, more creatively, and will force them to do things they've never done before in order to make that impact shift. You talked about employee resource groups, ERGs, hugely powerful. And we also know, and all the studies tell us, that the more diverse your board, and I highlight this because earlier on in the show, you said, we've got 5 white Christian leaders, it might be in a board. Well, it's going to be very difficult for them. Typically, you're going to hire someone that matches someone similar to you, right? But we know the more diverse we make those boards, the more people of color, the more women, whatever it might be that come into those boards, the more diverse our thinking, the more successful organizations come as a result of it. So I think there's loads and loads to take away in the responses that you've given there. And it was really, really interesting. From a recruitment perspective, for me, we often get the response of, I want to find someone that fits our culture. But if you're trying to fit your culture, you're already looking in the past, right? What is going to evolve your culture? I want to know who can I find that's going to take your culture from where it is now and progress it to where you want to get to. Because finding a like for like, that's not going to help you, right? That's not going to progress your organization. And it's just that little, they can be quite small shifts sometimes, but they can have monumental results if you're able to impact them. So with those they're just some of the takeaways I took from your response, which I thought was fantastic. But with all those things in mind then, Joseph, what are some of the skills then that DEI leaders and ERG leaders need in today's world of work? And I'm going to add something to that question, which is, I know as a podcast host, you'll say is a cardinal sin to ask 2 questions in one. But most of the people that listen to this show are HR leaders. Is that where DEI should sit? Should it sit with HR? And if that's the case, what skills do they also need?
DEI should actually be a separate function, I believe. I believe it should sit outside of any particular silo and be its own function, as focusing on 2 things: being an advisor to the whole organization and helping with input into the overall strategy at the top level and at all the other levels within the organization in terms of policy, practice, and so forth. HR has a role, obviously, to play, but so does marketing. So do other parts of the organization that want to make sure that they are addressing this changing group of people who are both their market and their workforce. I think for HR, the challenge is that HR can only do so much, and they've done as much as they can from within that HR lens. There's only so much that the HR group can do in terms of some of the things that fall into their wheelhouse, like providing training, providing opportunities for people to get together, helping maybe with the hiring piece of going out and looking for talent. And by the way, when you talked about recruitment and hiring, when people hire for culture fit, my latest thing that I've been pushing a lot in my articles and in some of my speeches is hire for culture add, not culture fit.
Yeah. Right.
Because culture fit, as you said, culture fit is retrospect. It's looking in the past. Not only is culture fit looking in the past, but it's based on this theory that people will be more innovative and work better together if they're all the same. That's a theory from back in the 1970s. Unfortunately, while that theory has been debunked, and we know that's not true because there are a lot of studies that show that it's actually differences between people that produce synergies, new ideas, innovation, and so forth. But even though that's happened, it hasn't cascaded into a lot of other areas, because in one breath, a person will say, well, it is diversity of thought. And then they'll say, well, we're looking for somebody who's a culture fit. So those two different disparate ideas, they haven't reconciled yet. And that also happens to be one of the big challenges with our AI systems. Our AI systems that are being designed today, from the one that was designed for Google and the others that have been designed for Amazon and other groups, they're designed to look at sort of like this whole idea of an exemplar, or somebody who's been really successful in the company in the past, and then try to match those traits to someone who we're going to be hiring in the future. The thing is that people were successful in the past within a certain context. Context. When the context changes, the skills, capabilities, ways of thinking, traits, and everything that made that person successful then may not be the ones that we need now. The other is that we're not going to get an understanding of the perspectives of other people around us, or be able to hire diversity to the point where we actually get diversity of thought if we're looking for all these similarities as one of the criteria of how we hire. So there is a lot. I hope I answered your question, because you had two questions, and I think I blended them together somehow. But I think that HR has done as much as HR can do, but HR cannot literally change the entire company's policies and practices around certain things like reimbursements and so forth. There's a limit to how much HR can do. And so if you don't change the structure, and you keep bringing people in order to increase diversity, and you keep trying to make them feel included through exercises like, Heritage Months and stuff like that, but nothing substantially is changing in the organization. Like, for example, we still have pay gaps between men and women, between people of color and others in the organization. If we don't change those things, if we don't deal with those things directly, there's no amount of Heritage Months and all these other things that is going to actually help the organization to engage people as they're coming in. And unfortunately, HR, a recruiter can recruit, a trainer can train, but then there are a lot of other players. These are only a couple of the instruments inside a larger orchestra. And unless they're all playing together, there is no symphony.
Sure. No, I love that response. I think, again, just to reflect a little, I think in terms of recruitment, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the culture piece is something that I've been pushing with the clients that I work with. But I think there's a paradox here we've got to consider as well, which is, if you think you're doing it for the workforce of now, like how the way that we as a community or as a world understands the word diversity, it's going to mean something different in 10 years than what it does now anyway. I mean, 10 years ago, businesses may have thought they were diverse because they had women and men in the organization, right? We've moved a long way from that already. And now it's not just about male or female. We've got other genders to consider. We've got transgender. We've got loads of things that diversity is also consistently evolving. So it's not just, people making steps to do what they think is the right direction, because you've got to understand this is a moving animal that's going to continue to evolve and shift and change, and the makeup of our workforce is going to continually be redefined. So again, it's kind of trying to stay ahead of that curve as much as we can. And to do that, we've got to make the changes that you're suggesting and go with it. And you were right. You mentioned great employees in one business 10 years ago may not be great now. And I work in recruitment, have done for 20 years. When I started, there was no AI or use of email even in the way that we use it today. And it was about door knocking and going around to people's offices and walking in and saying, I can help you, and looking through Rolodex cards. there were some great recruiters in those days. Some have evolved, some maybe not so, and they would struggle in the current market of AI and tech. So I think you made some really salient and valid points in that response. I'm glad I asked the question, and you did answer both of them very well. So you covered them both. I want to talk a little bit about your book, of course, your latest one, which is the new DEI and ERG Frontier. We talked a little bit about DEI and ERGs already today. But in the book, you state there is a new frontier out there facing DEI and ERG leaders, and it's one full of uncertainties. And when we talk about uncertainties, we're talking about things like the metaverse, robots, AI. Of course, we've just come through a major pandemic, the new world of work, the complete remaking and transformation of the workplace. And I've never seen so much transformation, particularly in the world of HR, than I've seen in the last 12 months. So with that in mind, how can HR leaders ensure their DEI and ERG efforts are ready for success in what is a rapidly changing landscape? Hello, HR and people leaders. Are you exhausted of the war for talent cliche? The problem is when we hear a cliche, it usually exists for a reason. However, we think it's time for a fresh approach to the talent crisis. That's because at JGA Recruitment, we understand the real challenges you face in sourcing phenomenal HR and people candidates. And guess what? We think we have the solution. Our team is on a mission to revolutionize your hiring process. That's because we're not just recruiters. We're strategic partners dedicated to finding HR and people professionals who align perfectly with your company's vision and goals. So let's break the cycle of frustration together. Partner your talent acquisition strategies with JGA Recruitment and experience the difference in service, excellence, and results. No longer do you need to suffer the costs associated with a poor hire, because with over 100 five-star Google reviews and already trusted by many of the world's leading brands, why don't you take action today? Contact us at jgarecruitment.com to discover how we can help transform your HR and people teams. And here's a bonus. When you visit us, you can sign up for our weekly HR newsletter that's packed with invaluable industry insights and more. Let's revolutionize your HR talent acquisition strategies together and make the war for talent a cry from the past. Visit jjrecruitment.com to find out more.
Yeah, a lot of what you just talked about basically translates into we need to invest more, especially in the ERG side, in training them better to really be more effective and to be better partners. One of the things that, we'll find in organizations is ERG leaders for sure are passionate people and they care. No one gives up their lunch hour and their spare time to do extra work on the side of their desk for a particular cause unless they care. And they care about the organization too, because if all they cared about was the community, they could get together outside and do that. They wouldn't do it on behalf of the company. So right there, you've got somebody who is putting their hand up and saying, I'll do more. I'm ready to, to help you, pull that load, as it were. Now, the unfortunate part is that a lot of them, because they are relatively early in their career, may not have the skill sets to be able to effectively align and connect to the organization's goals. They may not have the skill sets to put together an effective plan. They may not even know the full value of what they can offer. And a lot of times I'll hear people say, well, we've got one great ERG that's doing a great job. And then we've got like 5 others that are sort of, they're there, but they're not as productive. What's wrong with them, as it were? Yeah. And my response is there's nothing wrong with them. You're not leveraging them correctly. That's like a manager saying, my workers don't know what they're doing and they're ineffective. Well, have you trained them? Have you spent any time at all playing the leader part that you're supposed to play to help them to be able to be effective? So it's the same thing. Once people put their hand up and they say they want to lead one of these groups, it's really important to invest in them and train them and teach them to do things like, how do you determine what it is that you're going to be pursuing as a goal? I mean, one of the things that I use this model that you'll probably see in one of my earlier books, Supercharge, which is it's an impact map model. And it's really very simple. You identify, first of all, what are the opportunities and the pain points for your particular company. And by the way, if the company says, we want to increase the number of women in the organization by 20%. That's insufficient data to be able to actually formulate a plan, because you have no idea of whether that gap, or first of all, is it realistic? Because if you're going to increase 30% women, are you hiring a new crew, or are you firing people and then replacing them? This is not just these seats are not going to just magically appear. The other is, are you making offers, but people are not accepting those offers? If that's the case, recruiting is doing fine. Your hiring managers are doing fine helping, but there's something about the company that maybe is not attractive enough. So you have a different type of problem. So before you fill out that objective column or that opportunity column, you have to first identify what is the root cause, what is the root issue here, so that we could target that. Then you go over to the next column and you say, okay, great. Now that we know what those are, what are the goals that we need to have in order to be able to bridge those gaps, to meet those challenges, or to address those opportunities. And once you have that, the next thing over is you look at the next column and you say, what tactics do we need to take in order to meet that goal that will address those objectives that we've got at the other end? And then the last one is, well, what resources do we need in order to be able to do that? And resources could be the cooperation of a department or a group. It could be money. It could be budget, all these different things. And I teach them. I have taught a lot of people who are ERG leaders to do that, as well as DEI leaders, but doing it more for the DEI strategy. But I've taught them to do that so that they can then have this honest conversation about, what you want to do and what it takes to do it, what tactics and what resources. And if you tell me that I'm going to have half the resources, then we're going to have to go back and rework how many of those objectives we can really meet. But those are generally just plain old management planning skills. But if you don't have them, then you go around wondering what to do and you try to help, and maybe you'll have a Taco Tuesday, right? And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That makes people feel good and it makes them feel at home to some degree in the organization. But if that's all that you're doing, and there's an absence of other areas where you can drive value, like, for example, as I mentioned earlier, if you're a women's group, you can one of your goals could be to give the company feedback on what they're doing well, that's supportive of your community, and what could be done better. And then the organization can weigh that against other priorities and decide maybe there's some policy changes that are needed or some other things like that. You can also support other parts of the organization. Like, for example, some organizations in the United States that do business with the government look to bring in women-owned and minority-owned companies. Well, one of the biggest resources out there for connecting with a lot of these companies and so forth are people in ERGs who happen to either know of or be connected somehow to other external communities that can then help the supplier diversity person to do that. So there's a lot of different ways that these groups can be used, but investments have to be made for that. And in terms of the DEI leader, the CDO, whatever they're called in the particular organization, one of the things that would really help there is not only that they get exposed to other parts of the organization. So if they're housed in HR, the only way that they can actually address some of these upcoming opportunities and challenges is they have to color outside the lines. They have to do things that are outside and beyond just the HR pipe in the organization. If all they do is work with recruiting and work with let's say training and development and so forth, there's a limited value that they can drive to the organization. But if they start connecting with sales, they start connecting with operations, with branding, and with other parts, and giving more input into strategy, their value goes up. But of course, they need to also skill up to do that effectively. Yeah,
that makes total sense. There's something that I watched the talk, your response reminded me of, and it's, bear with me because it might not seem relevant initially, but the talk I watched was about mentorship. And the mentorship talking, there was an individual that put their hand in the air and said to the speaker on the stage, look, I've had a mentor for a long time, but I feel like I'm not getting any value out of that mentor. I'm doing this, that, and the other. I'm not getting anything back. And the talker said, the issue is not your mentor. Your mentor is doing what they've always done. The issue is you are failing to extract the value from that relationship, which is on you. You are the person that's requested and followed this mentor. If you can't get that value, it's on you. It's a self-reflective exercise. And I thought that was quite interesting. You're talking about investment, you're talking about the CEO, the DI expert, whoever it might be getting involved. If you want to get the most value out of these ERGs or these support groups, is you got to listen to the feedback. And you get a lot of ERGs giving feedback, but it's whether or not it falls on deaf ears, right? So we've got to be open and leave ego at the door and listen to that feedback and extract the maximum value. Because as you said at the start of that response, people will look at it and go, well, that ERG group is working way more effectively than another. It could also be actually they're both working highly effectively. It's just you're failing to extract the value out of one and you're managing to out the other. So I thought that was a really interesting response that you gave, and it just put that talk into my head. And maybe it's a bit of self-reflection for leaders to do there is, are we extracting the value of the groups we're setting up so in order for us to achieve the outcomes that we set them up for in the first place? Now, with that in mind, I know for the books that you've written, and you've authored on loads of talks and more, that you are a huge fan of research. You've had to be in order to create such wonderful masterpieces that you have. But I know that during the 4 years of research you undertook for the latest book, that you've been involved in pulse surveys, used hundreds and hundreds of hours interviewing CEOs, CDOs, ERG leaders, data scientists, DEI leaders, futurists, HR professionals, and more. I would love to know what some of the key insights, and I realize there's a lot there, probably a whole podcast on itself. But what are some of the biggest insights you've discovered during those interviews, during that research that perhaps our listeners can learn from today?
Yeah, there is a lot. Let me pick just a couple that I think might be of value to our to the listeners. One is that one of the surveys that I did, it was really interesting because one of the questions that I asked about AI was, do you think that the use of AI in an organization makes the sourcing and recruiting decisions more bias, less bias, no change? And I was surprised to find that a lot of people thought that the answer was less bias. Now, mind you, this was a little bit back when I first started putting together some research for this book. But the reason I found that so fascinating is that as I started talking to other people, I realized that that's the gee whiz technology effect. The idea is, well, this is an AI. It's not a human being with frailties like me. It's this superior intelligence. That's the amalgamation of wisdom of all these different people that programmed it. And what we fail to see is that these are tools that are nothing more than a big shadow of us. So whoever programmed it, whoever put data into it, and what data they gave to train it actually created basically created an algorithm or a decision-making string, and then gave it a worldview and said, within this worldview, pick the winners. And of course, that's controlled by how that world was set up. So I thought that was interesting because I think that one of the things that I think should be kept in mind is when an organization uses one of these systems, and let's say they just don't monitor it because they think that, well, it's an AI system, they are literally putting themselves in legal jeopardy because if that system turns out to have flaws, as many of them do, and at some point they are, they're sued, and it turns into a class action. I think a lot of organizations are probably under the impression, well, the vendor told me that it works like this, and it's the vendor system. Actually, you own it. Once you're using it, it's really your baby to run. It's like it's not the car company's problem if I hit someone with my car, even though they created the car. It's my problem because I was behind the wheel driving it, right? So it's the same thing. So I think that's important. That was one thing. The other thing that I found in my research, and it's really interesting too, recently I was using and I kind of took the research to another level. I started using ChatGPT, not so much to write, but to act as sort of a reflection partner. So I would say to ChatGPT, tell me what is the purpose and the overall, objective of DEI. And what it would do is it would it would basically give me all this information about how it was, about having more fair hiring practice. It sounded like it was quoting part of the EEOC and part of the affirmative action plan, good faith effort, and so forth, et cetera. And what that tells me is that even though we've evolved, literally, we've evolved to a point where this goes beyond the need for compliance. It goes beyond the need for having a good employer reputation. It goes beyond, what it used to in the past. We now have, ESG investors that are asking questions. And if you answer the question by saying, well, we won a diversity award, they don't buy that as evidence of any success whatsoever. They want to know, what have you done to close pay gaps? What have you done to do some of this material work? And so while the world has changed, a lot of the DEI information that's out there about what it is and what its objectives are and what it's meant to do seems to be limited to what it was created to do back in like the 1970s, when it was more about, we need to check those compliance boxes, and we need to make sure that we at least show good faith effort, and we need to at least, which is all obviously within HR's purview, but that's not enough anymore for investors. It's not enough for employees, and it's not enough for the market anymore. And so while the world has changed in terms of what it demands of DEI, DEI is still being defined within this very small definition where it's basically an HR program where you hire one person who runs around and does all this stuff to be able to hit your compliance numbers and so forth, not lose your government contracts and all that stuff that drives this underneath. So I think that was another thing, is that we've evolved, but in other areas, the actual practice and the thinking about what that practice is designed to do has not kept up. And a lot of organizations is still thought of as, well, my job is to go out and help recruiting, to recruit more women and people of color, or, the other thing that I found that's interesting, and I'll stop there because there's so many, but I'll give you three. Other thing that I found is that as companies have become more global, their definitions of diversity have not become global. And so in many cases, let's say you have an American company that, has a presence in different countries, and different countries may have their own efforts that are also driven by whatever dynamics they have going on where they are. A lot of these places that are outside the United States, they find that a lot of the practices that Americans try to export into their country are not effective because they're not relevant. Like, for example, when you talk about underrepresented people, that has a meaning within the United States because we have a history, and representation has to do with increasing. It has to do with a lot of the stuff that started in the late mid-70s, increasing the number of, people of color in a company and increasing all this other stuff. There are a lot of places in the world where that's totally meaningless, right? Then you also have certain types of programs that we put together and celebration that may not be the same somewhere else, maybe slightly different, or maybe they have dynamics that are not addressed. So that's a third one. So I'll leave it at those three. I will say that on the third one, I recently wrote an article. I think it's in Forbes or Fast Company, that talks about how to globalize your DEI practice. And one of the first things is the language. Instead of talking about underrepresented people or BIPOC or people of color, all these terms are US centric. If you're a global company and you have a global DEI practice, you need to maybe you have that language at the local level of people that are operating at your local level, but you have to have a larger umbrella that basically helps you support people that have efforts in other countries where they may have different contexts, different conditions. So I like to look at it more from the standpoint of, let's talk about DEI as being an effort to help people that were formerly undersupported to become more effective in the workplace. and it's good for the community, good for the company, good for everyone all around. But under-supported could mean one thing in China, mean another thing in the United States.
Sure.
In the United States, it could be the underrepresented. In China, it could be something else. In Mexico, it could be something else. But I think DEI at the global level needs a new language. So those are the three. I'll leave you with those three. And
loads of food for thought there. I loved your reference to AI. I mean, I've used ChatGPT a lot, and we sometimes forget that a lot of these systems are created in certain countries, and they're relying on research from those countries, and therefore the perspective even of the AI has to refer a little bit back to the people that created it in the region they created it from. If I use ChatGPT, it still comes back with a response in writing that has the American spelling, as an example. There's little things. I remember, I think it's been changed now, but initially, because it looks at the most recent research first, because research is always evolving and new discoveries are made, that when you talk about the atrocities, for example, in the Second World War with the Holocaust, that actually it picked up all the research from those that deny it and things like that. And you think, actually, this is not necessarily what I was looking for. It's supposed to be, it's not saying it's biased, but it's using a set of rules in order to come back with a response. And sometimes those rules can have faults within them, or perspective underlaid or whatever else. And I think any company that's using AI to absolve themselves of responsibility, I think, as you say, running on a bit of a tightrope, and I would be very cautious. I guess my last question for you, things I really want to hammer home. This is a fantastic book. There will be a link in the show notes to the latest book, New DEI and ERG Frontier. But for those that want to get themselves a copy, what does the book really do to address the role of diversity and inclusion in terms of strategy? What are the things that the readers can take away from the book to enable them to be better prepared for the future that's coming, and to allow them to create more effective DEI processes in response?
Yeah, the book does a couple of things, Nick, that I think are really useful. One thing that it does is it provides in the beginning a historical context so that people understand, where did this come from? And then it begins to show how it's morphing and how it's changing. And then it projects out what are some of the things within that cone of possibilities of where this can go based on those changes that are happening. And then finally, what it does is it basically advises people to do a couple of simple things. One is that in order to be effective, and this goes for any leader today, not just DEI leaders, but I'm talking to DEI leaders in this book, you have to become a bit of a futurist, or a futurist light, as I like to call it. You don't need to do all the models and so forth and, all the projections, but you need to start looking at the world around you from the standpoint of what are the signals versus what's the noise. And when you identify a signal, and to me, a signal, the difference between a signal and noise is that a signal is something like, for example, the demographics that we're looking at today. Noise is all the Twitterverse stuff that's going on with people who are upset about one thing or upset about another. There were people that were upset about the Industrial Revolution. There were people that were upset when cars started coming into existence. But guess what? We don't have a lot of blacksmiths around anymore. So the world keeps moving forward, and the noise dies down after a while, and the signal is what tells you what's happening. And then we need to start thinking about, well, what are the secondary and tertiary effects of what's happening? So we could start building strategies for what's coming up ahead of us. So the book talks about that. And that's really important, because we're living in a world today where, if you think about, as an analogy, if you think about the pace of the world in the past being like a stroll in the park, when you're strolling in the park, you just have to look a little bit ahead of you on the road to make sure there aren't any ruts or holes that you're going to fall into. But when you're driving a car, you have to aim a lot higher, because you're going at 50, 60 miles an hour. And now, you're going to be from here to over there much faster. So you have to be looking way ahead. So you have to aim a little higher. And that's one of the things that I talk about, is that need to be a little more of a futurist light. Then the other thing I do is, in the book, I have two sections. One is for DEI leaders, chief diversity officers, and that type. And then I have another that's for ERG leaders. And I give them 10 tips on what they can do to provide more value now and in the emerging future as it's shaping up. So one of the things, like for ERGs, is start using the group or leveraging the group that you have to provide perspectives to your organization, to feed that information up. And then a corresponding tip for DEI leaders is start leveraging those groups in order to create a picture of what it is that, let's say, for example, you have a women's community, a veterans community, an LGBTQ community, et cetera. Find out what the perspectives are of those groups in terms of what do they need, what's working well in your organization. You want to know what's working, and you want to know what can be better. And then pull all those together and start feeding that up to senior leadership so that they don't blindly go about making decisions to do things like saying, let's all go back to the office at a time when most of the schools might be open or might not be open. And you had a bunch of working mothers trying to figure out what to do. And then, of course, they're all caught by surprise by the reaction they get when people quit and so forth. That could have been avoided just by finding out what was going on and giving it a little more thought and maybe being a little more nuanced in the way that you put your new policy together. So that's, just to give you an example, but there are a lot of tips like that where the tip to the ERG is designed to help them do something that adds more value in partnership with the CDO, who's given a corresponding tip on what they can do with that so that they can drive more value to the organization.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's a fantastic book. There's a link directly in the show notes. Grab your copy from Amazon. There's other sites available as well, but I'll make sure the link's in the show notes. Not just that book, but also to Supercharge Your ERGs Power-up Strategy as well in there as well. So do take a look at that. Your response reminded me of there's something called the snow globe metaphor. When I was thinking about this for HR professionals and for CEOs and leadership teams, people are frantically want to do more, but it's a bit like at the moment. I love the way I referenced this because you made a comment about your tip for DEI leaders is to gain a view, gain perspective. What is the view you're trying to achieve? And a lot of people at the minute are shaking up their snow globe and there's things all over the place. They can't see the picture in the middle. But you got to let that stuff settle a little bit and work out which direction you want to go in, to work out which plates you want to spin and which ones you need to add to and get that perspective, that view. And I think there's a lot of people at the minute that are still in their snow globe clouds. And I think they could do with just working it out a little bit to get that direction they need to take it forward. It's been a fascinating conversation, Joe. I'm going to open the HR L&D vault. I don't know if you're familiar with this part of the show. Very quickly, we've got 3 short, sharp questions. But I've never had a futurist answer these for me. So I'm intrigued to see what you might say. So the first one is this. If you could give one piece of advice to the world, what would it be?
Start looking forward instead of referencing backward. I think that organizationally, it's important to start looking forward than backward, even more so today than it ever was before. And the reason for that is we're changing so much more rapidly today. In the past, there was a lot that we could just take from the past and then reuse. We could keep doing the same thing for a long period of time. Today, things are changing so rapidly that you cannot keep doing the same things for a long time and continue to be successful. So start looking forward at signals and using those as your reference for how you're going to conduct yourself, your policies, and your practices, as opposed to referencing your past.
Fantastic. Definitely the response of a futurist as well, I would say. So I'm glad I asked the question. Number 2, if you had the opportunity, what advice would you give to a younger you just starting out in this new world of work?
A younger me, what I would say is prepare yourself to always be learning and always be adapting. And again, it's almost the same advice because I think that the old model of you go to school, you grow up, you get a job, you do a job, 30 years later, you get a gold watch. That's gone. That's gone for, quite a number of years now. Not only is it gone, but it went from 30 years to maybe 5 years to maybe 10 years. And it's just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And so I think that a younger me, I would tell a younger me to develop myself as wholly as possible across a lot of skill sets. Don't narrow myself. That's another thing. Don't say, like I'm just, let's say a DEI person or an HR person or whatever. Those little containers may have worked well in the 20th century. They don't work today as effectively. Today, you need to use everything you've got. You need to develop all your different skills and your capabilities. And by the way, when you develop different skills and capabilities, you become uniquely more powerful than if you just fit yourself into one mold.
Absolutely. Well, a great response. And last but not least, and I have to ask you this because you've interviewed so many CEOs and senior leaders, right? What is the one guiding principle or behavior that you've seen in every great leader that you've worked with?
Every great leader that I've ever dealt with has a combination of confidence and humility. And it almost sounds like opposites, but they're not. And what I mean by that is that when they act with a level of confidence and decisiveness, but they don't close themselves off to learning. In fact, I interviewed one particular CEO one time, and it was on the topic of employee resource groups and DEI practices in the company. And this CEO spent an inordinate amount of time, inordinate by standards of other companies, with the leaders of these groups, asking them questions, inviting them to meetings from time to time. And when I asked, well, why do you do that? The response was, because they know stuff I don't know. They've had lived experiences that I have not had. And that only adds to my ability to make an even better decision instead of flying blind. And I think, to me, that is the epitome of a future successful CEO.
Yeah, what a fantastic response. Joseph, it's been a fantastic show today. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time talking to you. I think we could probably talk for hours on this subject. You're a real expert in this field, and you've brought a lot to the conversation, to the table, which I think our HL listeners can walk away from, having not perhaps considered before. I want to add to the people listening, there are a number of links I could direct you to. I'm going to put them all in the show notes. But for those of you that want to find out more, or even see some of Joe's televised work, some of his media appearances, I'm going to put some of the links in the show notes. He's been on the $1 Million Mastermind podcast. He's been on Ticker News with Mike Loder, the Founder's Story with Daniel Robbins, the Morning Blend with JJ Snyder on Channel 7, and more. So if you're interested in those and finding out more about Joseph's views and how, and his research and his books, please do have a look at those links. There'll also be a web link as well to joesantana.com, a LinkedIn profile link there if you want to connect. And of course, links to both of his books, the new DEI and ERG Frontier and Supercharge Your ERGs Power-up Strategy, and a link to his fantastic podcast, ERG PowerTalk. So please do check that out and subscribe to that as well if you're passionate about employer resource groups. There's probably nowhere else I can recommend better for you to go and find out more about that wonderful subject. And of course, if you're an HR leader listening to this show, but you need support with talent and attraction and recruitment, that's what I'm all about. That's what my team do. We do support people not just in the UK, but also in the US. We've got a business out there as well now. So whatever your HR requirements might be from a recruitment standpoint, if you need support, reach out to myself and my team at jgarecruitment.com. It just leaves me to say one more huge thank you to Joe for joining me today on the HR L&D podcast. I've enjoyed every single minute. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine.